The Southern Alberta Council on Public Affairs acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and we pay respect to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. We offer respect to the Métis and all who have lived on this land and made Lethbridge their home.
Our speaker today is Dr. Yale Belanger, who is professor at the University of Lethbridge. He has published widely on Indigenous and homeless issues. Also, for 15 years, he has been on an international editorial board member in Australia. He brings his expertise and experience to you today. His topic is, what story do we create about the homeless in Lethbridge? Welcome, Yale. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Y'all can hear me? Doing all right? All right, so apparently I have the this is an auspicious moment. We're starting late at SACPA, so I'm being blamed, so you can write this one down for posterity. Thanks, Bev. All right, let's make sure we got, okay, terrific. All right, today I'm going to be talking about the homeless. I have chosen the words carefully because over the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen this phrase pop up on a regular basis, the homeless. And I don't think that we're doing justice to a community that's incredibly dynamic and diverse, that is a community of our larger community that demands greater, I guess, political and bureaucratic attention at this point in time. It's a contentious phrase because, as you'll see, we tend to assign a very specific understanding to what the homeless means. So the goal of today is simply to take you through the journey of how I've been unpacking these ideas so that I can better understand how the Lethbridge Herald and how members of our city council are starting to present and understand some of these ideas. So the story is a little bit about me today. The story is about how we as a community understand and, I guess, reproduce this idea. But perhaps more importantly, the story today is, where is the origins of this? Where do they lay, and how do we understand how the ideas get created, how they get amplified, and how they get on a regular basis reproduced in our community to a degree that it's just normal at this stage to talk about the homeless. Now, the first slide I've got here is a recent book by Yuval Harari, where he talks about the importance of communication networks and how we link with one another, how we become communities by talking, by exchanging emails, by interacting in events like this in a very interpersonal fashion, and how these communication networks can work for both good and for not good. Today, unfortunately, we're going to be talking about a bit of the not good, but as you're going to see, there's some very positive things I believe that can come out of this discussion. When we start to engage in these communication networks and we start to take complex ideas and turn them into much simpler ideas, that's just natural. That's a byproduct of who we are. We want to take complexity and turn it into something simple so we can understand. The problem is we start to label at that point, and it's the labels today that I'm concerned about, in particular how we take an extremely complex sub-community in Lethbridge and turn it into 2 words, the homeless. This is part and parcel a process that Lee McIntyre has been writing about for the last 10 years of his career. He's an MIT philosopher who wrote a book called About Truth back in 2017, and he's upped his dialogue in recent years to talk about how misinformation and disinformation within large communication networks, smaller communities, universities, and institutions has started to take hold, and how we've become incredibly polarized in recent years. It's no longer about trying to draw from a pool of facts and then argue our position, as opposed to we've become oppositional and we have our own truths, and we're starting to, we're trying to replicate democracy based on the fact that, I've got a truth, you've got a truth, and we're colliding with one another at this point terribly. We can see it with the Signal Gate issue down in the United States. There's been no acceptance of culpability in terms of disseminating top secret, I guess, battle plans. What we're seeing is the Republican government is at this stage trying to mitigate the issue through a public relations lens, as opposed to by talking with one another, admitting a mistake, and then trying to fix the issue down the line. Now, I'm not suggesting that Lethbridge is the Republican government or that we are the Congress or anything like that, but these ideas are really important. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the creators and the amplifiers of misinformation and disinformation. And yes, I think you can discern that I'm going to identify the Lethbridge Herald in certain respects as a creator of disinformation, and as ultimately an amplifier of misinformation. And there are certain council members that I'm going to pinpoint as engaged in the same processes. What you're going to do is see some very challenging language today and some very challenging ideas. Everything that I'm going to talk about today comes from the public record. So people have spoken to the media, they have spoken in city council where everything is recorded, or they have produced for the purposes of publication in the media these words. All right, so when we get there, this is just not selectivity on my part. I've gone through all of the data over the last 7 or 8 years to get a sense of how these ideas are developing. The narrative that Lee McIntyre refers to is important because that's the idea that we latch onto. In this case, it's the homeless. But the homeless has become, as a concept, a little bit more complex, ironically, as opposed to just the group of individuals we see on the street on a regular basis. As you're going to see, dating back to about 2018, we have started to manufacture this idea of the homeless as addictions and criminality. Now, I'm not going to suggest that there aren't addictions out there. There are mental health issues out there. We cannot deny this. Certain members of the homeless community are going to be engaged in criminal activity. But as you're going to see, again, we start to distill this down into one specific group, and it's really easy to get caught up in talking about the homeless without recognizing those complexities. Now, for a number of years, I worked with the city of Lethbridge as a volunteer, probably 2004 through 2017, on a variety of housing and homelessness issues. Provincially, I had an opportunity to sit on a variety of different committees. And in 2017, I hit a moment of burnout because when you deal with these issues on a regular basis, I was writing about them, researching them, volunteering. It was just time to take a break. But I continued to monitor what was going on, and the best way of doing that is by checking out what the media is saying about these issues. In 2018 and 2019, and it was just a gut feeling, as I was reading the Lethbridge Herald on a more regular basis, I was getting a sense that the formerly progressive newspaper that talked about these ideas in a very positive way from the 1970s to the mid-2010s, I kind of got the feeling that it was maybe going off a little bit, maybe reducing things, maybe sensationalizing a little. I didn't give it too much thought, but I monitored this until a couple of years ago when we had the encampment summer, and I guess just over there. And unfortunately, it brought out a lot of the worst in the community. It brought out a lot of good. There was a lot of fantastic things that did happen, but it really it was a predominant talking point during that summer. And so what I did is I wanted to get a sense of how homelessness was being portrayed in the local media. And this is just the number of stories, 306 over a 7-year period that appeared in the Lethbridge Herald. That sounds about right, right? Less than 1 a week at the start, about an average of 30 for the first 5 years, according to this chart. But as you can see in 2022, the encampment summer, 2023, the lawlessness reduction task force, into 2024, from 2021 to 2022, it's a 50% jump. The next year, it's a 50% jump. So obviously, there's something that's driving the interest in these issues, but you can see there was always a little bit of interest. Now, what I wanted to do is get a sense of thematically how these things were being portrayed by the Lethbridge Herald. It's important to do more than just simply say all these stories were printed. So I went and took a look at those 360 stories, and I coded them, and I categorized them. And what you can see when you get rid of this general homelessness category, it's kind of a catch-all, it's a very benign category. You can see from 2017 to 2021, with the exception of 2019, where there's a little blip in that red bar on the bottom, it's a fairly reasonable spread of storytelling, right? We're talking about, poverty, we're talking about affordable housing, mental health, seniors, youth, there's some racism mixed in there. What we've got is a fairly well-balanced presentation of different ideas, and I thought, okay, that's pretty good. But what I started to see was homeless and addictions, homelessness and crime, being converged or merged into this category known as homelessness, addictions, and crime. I saw this in 2021 with a city council member who used those words almost verbatim for the first time. You can see after the supervised consumption site of 2019 into 2020 dropped off, it kind of levels off, but then suddenly from 2021 to 2022, things kind of explode in terms of taking a look at this issue of addictions and crime. When I blend those three categories together, getting rid of that big blue splotch again, which is that benign homelessness category, you can see that suddenly homelessness, addictions, and crime starts to take precedence as an overarching theme within the Lethbridge Herald. Now, what does this translate into? As you can see in that red line, by 2022, more than 2/3 of all the stories produced on homelessness concerns here in Lethbridge were actually about addictions, crimes, and homelessness blended together. Now, that's a significant shift when you take a look at the first couple of years, 13%, 7%, 21%. From 2020 to 2022, that's a 4-time increase, 400%. And you can see that in the meantime, those other 11 categories, which peaked in 2021, when you go back to 2017, it's on a downward trend the entire time. We stopped talking about the other progressive elements, how our third sector was doing, whether our interventions were effective, what was working in our community, in lieu of focusing exclusively on crime, homelessness, and addictions. Now, for some, this is not problematic because they're going to argue that, yes, indeed, homelessness is about addictions, homelessness is about crime, and certainly, if you were to read the Lethbridge Herald, that is a conclusion that you would come to. We know that the narrative is now starting to be created, according to McIntyre's framework. When I started to get a sense of how these ideas were being amplified, I took a look at all of the front page coverage over the last 7 years. And what I found is that in 2022, 2023, it peaks at 26 front pages. That's 10% of all the front pages that were published in the Lethbridge Herald that year. You can see that as there's an upswing leading to that 67% mark, there's an equal upswing in terms of where those stories are placed in proximity to where people are going to see the stories the most, above the fold. Now, this is how we publicize newspapers. I used to work at the Lethbridge Herald. I did newspapers before the Lethbridge Herald. I've got a very small 5-year career as a newspaper man. This is how we did it back in the day. We still do it today. So you can see that the narrative's been created. You can see that it's being amplified in a very specific way. I then wanted to get a sense of the stories. What was negative, positive, neutral? Really, when you start to take a look at it, it looks fairly level in terms of the negativity. I described tone and how these ideas are presented when we talk about positive and negative. But then I went and took a look at all the roasts and toasts. And this should be where the collective laughter begins, right? Now, everybody thinks inherently they're negative. There's actually some really positive, uplifting stuff in the toasts that goes beyond somebody bought me coffee at Tim's in the drive-thru today. And there's some really good things in there that if you want to take a really close look. If you take a look at on the left-hand side where it says homeless stories, from 2021 to 2022, there's a dip in the orange graph, which suggests that the negative stories are going down. At the same time, in 2021, we've got roasts and toasts going through the roof. It would suggest that the Lethbridge Herald is actually responding to public opinion, right? When we jump ahead and take a look at this chart, which begins in 2020, with all the amplification that's going on, if you take a look in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got in 2021, the roasts and toasts in response, following a year after the Lethbridge Herald started to amplify its coverage of addictions, homelessness, and crime. That's a correlation. I can't talk about causation, but there's a correlation there which suggests that the Lethbridge Herald is promoting a public narrative, it's promoting public opinion, and that there is a response in terms of how the roasts and toasts are responding to that amplification. Now, you're going to say roasts and toasts are not legitimate, whatever the case may be, and it is a very limited sample. But as I started to take a look at other sources, we're starting to see this concomitant rise. I can comfortably say that the Lethbridge Herald at this point is trying to frame public opinion. What they've done in the meantime as well is they've taken a very complex community of individuals and they've created a one-off category of homeless addicts. 306 stories. I went through them all, coded them, did what I'm supposed to do as a professor and all that good stuff. And we have taken homelessness in its most benign form to its most extreme form, and we have dropped it into the middle of this category known as homeless addicts, which is really unfair to the community of homeless, but it's really unfair to the community of Lethbridge, because what we're doing is we're backing ourselves into a corner and only looking at a very small subset and creating policies in response to that subset. Who are the homeless in Lethbridge when we break away from the Lethbridge Herald way of looking at things at this stage of the game? The point in time count in 2022 identified that we had 454 individuals that would be identified as chronic, people living on the street, sleeping rough. Those numbers rose from 89 in 2016 to 223 in 2018 to 454 in 2022. That's a substantial rise. Unfortunately, when we talk about the homeless in town, we're talking about this community. We have forgotten that there's situational and transitional homeless community within that larger grouping. When we talk about how we come to these numbers, what we do is we take the point in time count and we assume that for every one individual who's living rough and chronic, there's probably another 3 that are living in town situational or transitional. At this stage of the game, we've got roughly 1,500 individuals in this city that the Canadian government, the Alberta government, academics, and so on and so forth would identify as homeless. We just don't break them into these categories. What we do is we talk about the homeless in terms of addictions, crime, and in terms of addictions and crime. So what I'm seeing at this stage is a very specific narrative being structured, and I'm going to argue that this is compromising the integrity of that institution. And the newspaper is absolutely essential. The last thing I want anybody to do here today is go and cancel their subscription to the Lethbridge Herald if you've got it. In fact, if you don't have a subscription, get one, because it's absolutely a pillar of democracy at this point in time. All right? We need it, and it needs to do better, but nevertheless, we need it to start with. It is, unfortunately, as a piece of democracy, leading to the erosion of democracy in many ways. Now, this is where things are going to get a little dicey. Newt has agreed to act as my human shield, so throw what you want. That sweatshirt, you can clean that in a heartbeat, no worries, all right? Back in 2018, I can see the seeds of this dialogue being planted in this one column. Now, it's not just this one column. There's a variety of other ones that were written around the same time. And not only by Mr. Bieber, who was a long-time reporter, and obviously he was the most recent managing editor for about a year and a half. But he was really upset with all the needle debris that came with the increase of drug addiction here in town, and he identified that he had dissatisfaction with the way council was handling issues. He said, the new Democrat Party, social workers and local politicians, they'll try to tell us they're fixing the problem when they aren't champions of the addict, they're champions of a paycheck. They're pretending to be the Florence Nightingales of Lethbridge. Now let that sink in for a minute, right? I love my town. I've never called it Lethbridge. I've got problems with, like everybody else, with things that are going on, but this is incredibly provocative language. What he's doing is he's identifying the existing town council, city council, as not up to the job. He's suggesting that the new Democrat Party are just a bunch of dummies. You may or may not agree, but the point here is that we're starting to see the narrative being framed in a very specific way. This narrative, and these are just 3 little stories that appeared in 2022, focusing on crime, homelessness. The issue of crime and homelessness. Concerns about crime and homelessness. We hired somebody to focus on crime and homelessness. You can see that this homeless community of, what did I say, 1,500 individuals, is now being reduced into a community that is exclusively that of addicts and those that are engaged in crime. It's a very small subset that we're really talking about, but we're starting to focus all of our energies on this one little subset, as opposed to focusing on the larger issues. This is where things hit their very worst, as far as I'm concerned. And again, this is just my opinion, right? The ex-cop, Radar. Is Radar here today? I'd love you to out yourself, he or she. I didn't say it. We've got an individual who says he's an ex-police officer who has been dealing with these issues forever, who stated quite clearly this isn't a homeless problem, it's a crime problem. It fits almost every category there: misinformation, disinformation, fake news, echo chambers, and confirmation bias. Jump ahead to the next page. This column is on the bottom there. Political activists, I guess such as myself, we're always trying to feel good about ourselves. The thing is, if you go and you don't give them something, you'll get a knife in the ribs. These people are criminals. They have a criminal mind. They had jobs, they had families, there was no trauma in their life. They chose to use drugs. It's a choice. They need to be held accountable. We do good that as a society to make ourselves feel good to try and help them out. This is harsh. And this is chosen by an editorial team to run. As a newspaper individual who worked for about 5 years, I never used an anonymous informant, ever. Ever, ever. Right? This is incredibly offensive on a number of different levels, both professionally and socially. Nevertheless, you can see at this point that that buildup from 2018 until 2022, 2023 is happening. Now, policymaking gets into the mix here, because the newspaper is not exclusively the only agent that's starting to amplify these ideas. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about some policymakers in town and how they have started to present these ideas that in 2021 with the new council started to amplify the same message. These are all public statements, folks, and they're all public pictures too, all right? Everything's available free online. You see it all over the street. It's a walking zombie land, right? The ideas of the homeless, addicts, that sort of thing. This was in response to the mustard seed request to open up here in town that was ultimately shot down, and not Mayor Higgin at the time, but Councilman Higgin at the time had some very pointed language to say about it. He's not the only one. During the encampment summer of 2022, Councilman Ryan Parker spoke out quite eloquently at City Council on a couple of different occasions. In particular, when he was asked whether or not homeless individuals have a right to shelter, he said, it's a really gray area whether people have the right to shelter. I challenge that personally. He does not believe that. I think we should remove them, physically detain them, and move them from the space. And if people don't like what we've done, they can take us to court because, well, they're not actually homeless. These are our elected officials, folks, and they're amplifying the message that has been created by the Lethbridge Herald. We're now starting to see an echo chamber developing, right, where they're reaffirming the messaging that over a 4-year period till today has remained fairly consistent. We're also starting to see the development of a public safety lens developing by which we're interpreting all of these issues. We've got an election coming up. I want everybody to email me in August and September and tell me how many people are promoting public safety when they run their campaigns. I'll show you in a second that this is all, dissipating. Crime is going down. It's been confirmed, yet we are still talking about these issues on a regular basis. We've got a councillor saying that your constitutional rights to freedom of movement should be constrained, that your rights against being detained by the state should be constrained, that you can be physically removed from a community because you're deemed to be an odious individual. Perhaps the most significant amplifier in all of this is Councillor John Middleton Hope. I just had a couple of quotes. I could have done the whole talk on this, just quotes from John, right? He's very vocal. He's very impassioned, right? But he said very clearly, especially related to the encampments, they're the temporary abodes of the homeless. They're garbage-strewn, biohazardous, unsafe environments. One of my priorities when he talked about putting a fence around Galt Gardens to limit homeless individuals from utilizing that space was to displace abnormal users. Once again, the language, it's just off the charts. But when you see this all in sequence and not just little quotes and stories, it starts to tell us a very important tale about how a very significant voting bloc within the city council at this stage of the game thinks about these ideas. What's the narrative that we're seeing here? They are abnormal people who live in garbage-strewn, biohazardous, and often unsafe environments. Hey, some do, all right, by virtue of whatever barriers are being experienced at that moment in their lives. They are folks who do not have shelter, and it compromises our local sense of community. Their irresponsible acts compel us to curtail their individual rights for our collective good. It's an unproblematic turn for most who may not be homeless. They've abandoned their homes to party, Alan Mr. Parker. Turning a blind eye invites Zombieland to reassert itself and traumatize us. Outcomes that are one self-serving political party and associated do-gooders champion. What have we got? Lethbridge, a community slowly collapsing before our eyes. We have an echo chamber established, folks. I just did it. There you go. It's been ongoing for the last 4 years, and there's a very clear understanding now of who the homeless are. Now, once again, we get to 2022 and everything peaks, right? The reason that I suggest that there might be something positive to draw from this, you can see in the last 2 years there's been a decline in the focus on that narrative. At the same time that those other 11 categories are being re-emphasized and new stories are being told, at the same time that that general homelessness category is also starting to grow. So as we're starting to see the negativity and the deficit drop, we're starting to see more positive stories develop at this point. What are the conclusions that we can come up with here? Well, I'll allow you to, obviously come to your own conclusions on a lot of this. We're hyper-focused on a very small group of individuals who unfortunately have come to symbolize a homelessness community in Lethbridge that numbers upwards of probably 1,500 to 1,800 individuals. We're not prepared to respond because we have established a public safety lens, right? Not public health, right? We're not able to respond to any of this. Now we got tariffs that are coming down, folks. Our GDP is going to drop in the next 8 months. People are going to become homeless. AISH has been cut. Oh wait, AISH has been cut. AISH has been cut 3 times in the last 45 days. If you don't think we're going to see an increase of homelessness at the transitional and the situational levels, bleeding down into the chronic categories, you got something else to think about. Our elites are focused on framing this community as a public safety threat. City Council and the Herald are not taking their lead from the public, and that's perhaps the most important thing to walk away with from this talk today. They're manufacturing public opinion, and I can demonstrate how they're doing it. I can actually demonstrate, too, that the public opinion is responding in kind. Ultimately, the tale today is the stories that we tell are incredibly important. They're more than just words to win an election. They're more than just words to win a debate in council chambers or to sway somebody to your belief system. Who we prioritize through these stories is important, and ultimately it impacts the solutions that we as a community pursue that are beneficial to everybody. Thank you.
Next week's speaker is Lance Grigg, and he is speaking about chess for life at the University of Lethbridge. How might chess help those involved in the criminal justice system? Okay, next comes our question and answer period, and we ask those who are waiting to ask questions to please line up along this wall and state your name and your question briefly. No long preludes or stories, please. We expect respectful and polite discourse, otherwise I'll kick you out. If you prefer to write your question, only those legibly written and signed will be asked by the moderator. Okay, thank you. Let's call Yale back to the microphone. Thank you.
No questions?
Oh, they're coming.
Okay.
They're coming. Okay.
Hello, my name is Nathan Swoboda. I'm your federal NDP candidate in this next election here. But I've worked with the unhoused and mainly addictions population for about the past 5 years, very intimately in like professional and volunteer work. And so I guess this kind of brought the question that there is a separation between being unhoused and addiction, but also that those two are such contributing factors to each other. So to what extent and how do we beneficially separate those two? And so when it comes to the rhetoric and the language that we use in the public, to what extent and how do we beneficially detach the homelessness versus addiction?
Okay. Thank you. Okay. I'm Yale Belanger. I'm going to be running for city council in the next election. Oh no, my wife is mad. But Jeff is happy. It's the language that we use. It's just pure narrative. Like I said, and I say it somewhat facetiously, but I say it with an air of concern. These were just a handful of quotes that I pulled out. I've got dozens and dozens of quotes from these and other individuals in town who will say, our homeless response demands a recovery intervention approach. Well, instantly you start to talk about addictions, right? I've heard downtown described as a war zone, the Galt Gardens, where bodies are being pulled out on a weekly basis. So when we start to use that sort of incendiary rhetoric, and it becomes normalized to the point that, as I've demonstrated, the homeless is instantly understood as criminality and addictions, we now have to actually make a conscious effort to take that step back. And it's incumbent upon City Council to now start utilizing the specific categories in specific ways when the dialogue about homelessness in town starts to pop up. It's incumbent on the Lethbridge Herald to break away from this narrative that they've created and start to present these ideas in a much more equitable fashion. Really, it all starts with us by writing letters to these individuals and letting them know how unhappy and dissatisfied we are and how impactful it can be within our community. Because right now, if we've got 1,500 individuals that could potentially grow to 2,000 individuals by the end of this year who are homeless in this community, yet our focus is exclusively on 75 rough sleepers that are addicted criminals, we are ignoring the vast majority of individuals we would identify as homeless under different categories. So precision, the narratives that we tell, focusing less on getting elected as opposed to doing the job, and writing letters. I think those are the main ways that we can start to maybe shift the dialogue a little bit.
Hi, Barb Phillips, senior New Democrat, I guess. Anyway, excellent presentation, because I have followed this issue in my 11 years here in Lethbridge, and I have been on the streets from Arches to adopting a little neighborhood park, which is 2.5 kilometers from downtown, but I see some issues and I meet a lot of people. Because I'm not afraid to say hello, greet these people, and for sure, they should not be all lumped together into the three as it appears our public commentary has become. My question is, though, you sort of said there's 1,500 estimated, approximately, people that fall into the categories of the homeless in Lethbridge. But I believe a point in time, the PIT number was taken across Canada in the fall, September of last year, 2024. And I have seen PIT numbers for many cities in Canada, but is that the official PIT number or is that a guesstimate?
Everybody's so tiny. It's an official guesstimate, is my best response. Now, 10 years ago, when I was doing a lot more work with the city, we usually use the number 2.5 to 3 to talk about those who were situational and transitional. So for every individual in the PIT count, we suggested there's about 3 more individuals that we would identify as homeless. Now, in an economy like this, where things are shifting so significantly, just an example, I came prepared for some of this. That's our vacancy rate right now. It's below 1%. 2% is a healthy vacancy rate. So we don't have places to put people. We've got a fluctuating economy. We can see here that people in encampments on a constant basis, it's just reappearing over and over again. That's kind of the canary in the coal mine in many ways. I would suggest that the 1,500 is low. It's just my factoring 454 with an additional 3 on top of that. I would probably suggest we're in the 2,000 to 2,500 range at this point. And that number is going to grow significantly as tariffs take an impact on our GDP, as we start to confront other issues such as AISH cutbacks in town, lack of affordable housing. We're not growing. Our housing is growing at the same rate that our population is growing at, which means we're not closing the gap there. So, oh, she was the one who said, shut your phones off. She's gonna come and kick me next, right? So So based on how we did things methodologically 10 years ago, that's the number that I arrive at today.
I pretend to be tall. Hi, I'm Henning Mundel, so you don't have to up and down. No, it's okay. I appreciate the data you gave and the definite juxtaposition of the media and then I think the way you put it, sort of correlationally, and then the response by certain city council members. I'm overgeneralizing. But I wonder, while you give quite a bit of detailed data here, do you have any idea, sort of province-wide or beyond, generally, are there similar associations? Can we expect that to be in communities throughout our province and beyond?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. All the questions have been good. That's a really good question. I was not able to find any research across Canada that would allow me to make a generalization. And that's why I decided to do this. It was both out of interest because it's my community, but I'm also transitioning. I'm at that existential stage in my career where I want to do something else research-wise over my last 10 years. And so I found this little niche. I haven't found any other research across Canada that will allow me to talk to that, but my gut tells me that if we go to Brandon, we might be finding the same thing, right? If we go to Thunder Bay, wherever there's a local newspaper, and a newspaper that's independent, not a post-media, run by the United States Republicans newspaper, but one that's independent, that has close ties to the community, and where we're starting to see homelessness flourish in the same way, I think we would see like trends. That's just anecdotal, it's my gut, but I would think so.
Maria Fitzpatrick, and I'm going to come from my career as a 32 and a half years working in Correctional Service Canada. You reaffirmed certainly what I had seen while I was working in corrections. Certain political parties put out a narrative. And one of the narratives while I was working in Ottawa was about increase in crime. It wasn't true. I had the numbers right in front of me. I had the costs. And their campaign came out about tough on crime. And I was within corrections, so I couldn't publicly speak out. But I did speak to the Commissioner of Corrections, and I said, we have all kinds of positive stories about people who come through the system, who participate in the programs, and move on to live pro-social lives. And that's not what's being said by particular parties. So my question to you is, how can we get those people that are inside that have that factual information, how can we get that information out to the public with the same push that the political parties are putting on the disinformation, the misinformation that they're putting out?
I do not know. That's not, I don't mean that in a glib way. If I'd known you'd have been here, I would have emphasized that Democrat part in the slide a little bit more. I don't know. It's the great existential crisis of our time from a democratic perspective. The notion that misinformation and disinformation is so easily overwhelms what would be considered the truth, or at least it obscures that common pool of knowledge that we all draw from. Like Daniel Moynihan said, you're entitled to your opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. And we're running into this right now, it's colliding. So I think that the best way to do it is just to put out better information syntheses, right? Not just counter with more information, because what we find is that it just becomes more white noise in the ecosphere. You've got to be more targeted in terms of how we start to present these narratives. And a newspaper like the Herald, For example, economics have devastated this newspaper, right? They've got 4 people in the newsroom, I think 3 selling ads. When I worked there back in the day, there was 15 people in the newsroom alone, right? So they're on a shoestring and they're trying to make it work. What they need is copy. If you wanted to write a piece, if somebody in here went and approached the new managing editor, Scott Sackage, and said, maybe we could put together something on a monthly basis, I think that they would be open to the idea. They would take the copy, they would give it prominence, and that would be the start of countering the mis and the disinformation with more accurate representations of what's really going on in the world. That's just one example or one idea, but that's what I would recommend.
Hello, I am Katie Aurora, and I am running for the NDP in our neighboring Foothills riding. You've talked a good amount so far about media and the role they play in pushing these narratives. And I did, just like while sitting here, I did actually look it up for the Lethbridge Herald, and they are actually owned by part of a pan-Canada conglomerate of news media. So it's a pretty similar issue when you look across the entire country. Our independent and local news media is dying, and increasingly, increasingly they're being bought up by these right-wing organizations, hedge funds. You look at National Post, and it's leading to a very specific narrative being pushed, a narrative that says you should be fearful and you should hate the people who have less than you. And we can't leverage the wealth that we have in this country because, well, it's the poor people, it's the queer people, it's the whoever. And it's tearing ourselves apart. And so you've spoken a little bit about this, but in terms of policy prescription, how do we actually go about countering this?
I always tell my students when a tough question is asked, if I knew the answer, I'd bottle it, sell it, and retire down in Panama next to Danielle Smith. The media it's a complex entity. And I don't want to prescribe an outcome, because we still have freedom of expression and people do have the right to express their opinions. I've got problems when we're developing echo chambers and they're trying to do the same thing to us, prescribe an outcome amongst us. The best thing to do is just to become media literate and to start focusing on the sources that you can trust. But I think it's also vital that you don't get isolated in your own little bubble. So many of my students, they say, I read 6 newspapers and I watch this and this and this, and it's all from the liberal perspective, or it's all from the conservative perspective. You've got to start reading all of these pieces. And it's important to know what Fox is saying. I know I'm going to be vilified for that, but it's vital that we know what Fox is saying. Like this morning, Signalgate, all the major networks said that this is a terrible breach of national security, and Fox said, we've all sent a bad text every now and then. It's important to know how the other half of the community, if it's not your community, is thinking. So it's just media literacy, information literacy, and becoming more active. These events are incredibly important. Well, we got 100 people today, roughly 125. This is an important space because you're all going to go and talk about this, whether you liked my presentation or not. Yale, he's full of crap, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's going to be talked about, and it's going to be, the data is going to be crunched, and the ideas are going to be at least given some concentration. You might have liked what I had to say. You're going to go out and you're going to talk to more. And from a business owner's perspective, those who didn't like my talk today, you're going to talk to about 38 people. Those who like the talk, you're going to talk to about 9. So I'm actually hoping a few of you didn't like it, because you're going to reach out to a vast group of individuals who are going to hear it, right? So that would be, just a couple of my responses. So.
Hi, Yale. I'm Bob Campbell. Thank you for your presentation. He spoke the truth. Yale and I go back a ways. A couple of comments first. We talk about crime and so on. We know crime is going down, but the reporting of crime is going up, and that's one of the dilemmas we face. Secondly, you quoted Yuval Harari. He said that facts will never convince people of anything. You have to build a story around it. And so when we have close to 1,500 people who are homeless, we need to profile some of those folks, because we know some of them are actually working, but they can't afford a place to sleep or a place to live. Those are things we need to get stories out. And I could go on and preach a whole sermon on this, but my comment, and then you can kind of reflect on it, we used to talk about the social determinants of health, and those are basic things, right? Income, housing, et cetera, et cetera. You don't hear that discussion anywhere coming out of our government sources here in this province or in this city. And I think that's something we really need to be looking at. You can comment on that.
I didn't have to adjust the mic. Yeah, Bob and I, we go back a long way. We were in the homelessness consortium many years ago. We were responsible with 4 other individuals in the province for crafting the data collection for all of homeless policy development at one stage of the game. So I have a lot of respect for the comments and all the work that Bob has done over the years. He stopped driving to Calgary with me, though. He was scared for our meetings. I'm sorry about that. We need to tell stories, and that's why I started with storytelling today. This is part of my story, my reflection, but it's also part of a variety of other people's ways of crafting these stories. Once again, though, we need to get them into the same space, right? And that's why I suggested there are good, feel-good stories out there. There's some not-so-feel-good stories where people who are homeless are working 30 hours a week for the minimum wage, and they just can't afford anything. These are the stories that we, perhaps as citizen journalists, now start to tackle and put into the same space that the Lethbridge Herald is using to put these nasty stories up. Because after a while, when we start to hear something different, our attention will gravitate to it. In terms of the social determinants of health, that's a very, and I don't want to pigeonhole a party, but it's a very UCP approach to doing business. Like yesterday, for example, Jason Nixon got up and called encampments dirty and crime-ridden and so on and so forth. I don't want an encampment any more than anybody else does, because it suggests that we have failed as a society. People are not living in good conditions. But he, as an example, has really done nothing to end the issues by combating the social determinants of health that led people to that situation, right? But we won't talk about those issues because that costs money. There's a complexity to that dialogue that really does escape most folks. And at the end of the day, it makes for really good copy, especially when we've got, as was identified, newspapers that really do like to jump on the more sensational narratives. So nobody spoke to Jason Nixon's opponent who said you shouldn't say that. They just threw Jason Nixon's comments on the front page and ran with it, right? So I do believe, and I teach social determinants of health in my Canadian politics classes because it's absolutely essential. But really, we don't see that in the universities anymore, unless you're in health sciences. We don't really see it in the public. So it's our job now, like Bob just did, to amplify that message. And people are now going to go, geez, social determinants of health. They're going to go home, they're going to read about it, and again, talk to your 35 neighbors. And suddenly the dialogue, it's got some ability to start to grow at that point in time. So.
Hello, everybody. My name is Amber Murray, as you can tell by my shirt. I'm sorry about the visual aggressiveness of that. That was Belinda's idea for those of us who are running a campaign on a shoestring. My question is, what do you think, my question is, if the federal government did commit to building public funded housing again and committed to keeping it low cost, how long do you think it would take to affect homelessness?
It took 2 years in the 1990s to disassemble our public housing model that started to develop in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. We did not have homelessness to the degree that we see today across Canada because we did have public housing in place. 1995 till today, that 30-year period is a direct byproduct of that thinking, which was started by Brian Mulroney, but it was actually affected by Jean Chrétien. So this is not a partisan issue by any stretch of the imagination. It's a societal issue. When you take a look at the social housing and the public housing model that was developed starting in the late 1940s and the 1950s, it came into fruition in the late 1960s. If we started right now, dedicated the money, dedicated the energy, it would probably take us 3 to 4 years before we were actually able to put shovel in the ground across Canada, probably 2-3 years for every project. If we expedited it and everybody was behind it and we didn't have opposition to these ideas, at a minimum 10 years. But then that would also have to be based on anticipating what the growth of homelessness based on economic issues and so on and so forth is going to look like 15 years from now. No government is going to overextend itself, though. So as soon as we build that public housing based on the data that we've got right now, we're already going to be behind. We're going to be in better shape. But public policy is about looking at the past, taking the data that we've got right now and projecting into the future. And it sounds really contradictory, but that's how we do it, right? If we start now, in 10 years, we'll be able to catch up and at least say that we've got enough housing, knowing that in the next year, we're probably going to start to fall behind. And again, the emphasis there is on continuing reinvestment. Social policy is about investment. It's not about expenditures, right? We know that managing homelessness in Canada is going to cost us, for Housing First as an example, a big study done out in Montreal a few years ago, the Chessois project, demonstrated that for every $9.37 that we spent on housing, or no, for every $10 we spent on Housing First programming, getting people into secure accommodations, we would see a return of about $9.37. So we were losing 63 cents on every $10. But nevertheless, if we were to manage homelessness, it's probably going to cost us 10 times that. Right? So the expenditures that we're putting out at this point in time, it's just astronomical for the management of this issue, when if we just cobble all that money together at once, we could probably do something fairly effective as a community. So.
Thank you very much, Yale, for your very knowledgeable presentation. My name is Knut Petersen. Quick question, has anyone from City Council or the Lethbridge Herald, for that matter, been asked you to share your knowledge on this topic?
No. Next. I could elaborate, but no. Like I said, I took a break, and during the encampment summer of 2022, I reached out to a variety of people at the city, and I said, look, I'm not some, seer of the future who can resolve all these issues, but I got a skill set, and perhaps it could be useful, right? Didn't get a call back, and in fact, it got quite derogatory on a number of different occasions. Lethbridge Herald hasn't spoken to me, reached out to me since 2017. So I'm not really sure of that one. I can understand the city council. I have been a thorn in the side of a number of councillors, so I can understand their reticence to engaging with me, but I don't understand the Herald, considering I worked with a lot of these people for a long period of time. Or maybe that's the answer, but either way, I think the larger question is, not including myself, let's just remove me from the mix for a moment. We've got 15 people in this city that I can just rhyme off right now who have had a tremendous impact on our policy understanding, our local response, who have gone to international conferences and spoken about this, who are accepted by the international academic community as seers in many ways. Take me out of this. So those 14 people also have not been asked to come to the table. So the university at this point is being kind of shut out, and it's unfortunate because we have an incredible level of capacity, an incredible level of empathy, and an incredible drive to participate in our community that's not being exploited right now. So.
I'll try to be quick. My name is Gordon Dixon. I've lived in Lethbridge now for almost 2 years. I moved here because my daughters decided that where I was living, and it is listed, quite frankly, I was living in a city, small city in north central Saskatchewan. Where I was living was listed as unsafe, and I can share that with you. I'm going to speak somewhat as a victim, because I walked in 5 years ago. I walked into my backyard and saw the garage door was splintered and broken, and walked in and ended up getting beat up. My daughters now have said, "Dad, you can't stay there. You're on your own. We need you where we can keep an eye on you." Probably for several other reasons too. But I think one of the problems when you create the narrative that we have is when you're a victim, you begin to look for an answer. Why did this happen, and why did this happen to me? And I think the first thing you go to are those narratives that become popular. And I don't think we end up dealing with the problem when we kind of glom onto those kind of narratives that are there. And I don't think we really come to grips with what happens. I kind of moved through those moments by saying, I understand trauma. I understand what put people, ends up making people homeless. You start rationalizing all that stuff and so forth, and I could move on. I want to thank you because you're helping me to reframe that. I can't figure out how homeless people, quite frankly, would be able to steal 4 tires. You're walking down the street with, So, it obviously wasn't homeless people, but the area I'm living in had become a pathway for homeless people. There were homeless people there. And that became the easy way to understand what happened to me, until I kind of moved through that. Now, the other thing is, I want to say is that...
What is your question?
Yes, it's a response. I'm sorry. My sense is that in the 70s and 80s, is when we started moving to make these wonderful payment subsidies to corporate entities and started to fall back in terms of our social network. So I think I'm just asking for some kind of response to that, because that's where I see the problem. It's not what happened in 2010. It's what's happened in the 70s and 80s. So thanks.
I'll just reply quickly and say I'm glad that, what I've had to say today has been helpful. As far as all of that, yeah, there's a long history. And if you want to stick around afterwards, I can bore you with a 15-minute assessment of how this has all gone down. But yeah, this is not an issue that developed 3 years ago or 6 years ago with the supervised consumption site. This is something, the seeds were planted many moons ago, and it's just starting to flower at this point in a significant way. So.
The 2 questioners that are here will be the last.
I'm Ian Herald, and it struck me when you talked about the dismantling of the public housing in the 90s, because our doctor shortage is directly related to the mid-90s cutting back medical schools by 10 to 15%. So 30 years later, we're in a bit of trouble.
Yeah. And just very quickly, like I said, this is not a bipartisan issue, but when Jean Chrétien came into power in 1993, he came in with the promise of cutting taxes, right? And that's been the mantra across Canada ever since. What he did is he balanced the federal budget on the backs of the provinces. And the provinces are responsible for a lot of these social deliveries and a lot of these social systems and so on. So we immediately had to start making cutbacks down here at the provincial level, and things like AISH, like today, and homelessness and public housing and so on, they took the hard hit. So this is really a trickle-down effect from a liberal campaign promise in 1993 that, again, 30 years later is playing itself out in terms of housing, homelessness, doctor shortages, all sorts of issues. So.
Good afternoon. My name is Stan Knowlton, and what I'm looking at there is sort of I guess a canary in the coal mine, based on some of the stories that our elders had told us, many years ago, even back as early as the 1960s. The Indian news media in Cardston recorded some of the elders, and I still have a tape. And whenever I start getting a little bit nervous about what's going on, I always put the tape on and re-listen to, what was being said, back in them days. And, they didn't have graphs like this, but in the best way they could, they'd always tell the stories that were very similar to, what I'm seeing here. And, when we look around at any place in North America, we can see exactly the same thing going on. All you gotta do is take a trip to Edmonton, Calgary. People are gonna come up to your window, start banging on it. But it's not the only place that's like that. On the reserve, I'm from the Piegan Reserve, and we had 10 cities last year. So it's happening globally. And my question is that, how do we use this canary in a coal mine, to identify the bigger picture that's going to be coming at us very quick?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It gets back to a question that was asked a little while, Knud's question about whether or not I've ever been approached. This data is just sitting here, folks, right? Like, I can present it. I'm going to publish this. It's going to be part of the next 10 years of research that I'm going to do both locally and nationally. I work with other communities. I don't work with my own community, right? So what we've got to do, from my perspective, is start to build in the expertise at the university, at the college, from the third sector. A few years ago, we dismantled our systems network here in town. We used to have a really good system put together with interagency coalitions and so on, where we would get together and talk about this stuff on a weekly basis. We would exchange knowledge and information. I would bring some academic stuff. Third sector would come in and bring their ideas. And over a period of 3 or 4 years into 2014 and 15, we were humming. And we were recognized, and I've told this story so many times, but we were recognized internationally. Alberta was recognized internationally as one of the leaders in the homeless and housing dialogue. Right? Our examples were showing up over in the UK, in France, in Australia, New Zealand. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've become a laughingstock because we've intentionally undone all of the good work that we put together. So once again, it's one thing to have these data. It's another to actually synthesize them and bring people together to start talking about their experiences, how this resonates with their experiences, and how we can start to develop policy based on all of that information together.
Yale, do you have one thing to leave us with? Maybe an action?
Yeah. Tip your waitress. I honestly, I don't know. I think if you've been listening to everything that I've kind of, threaded today, just give it some thought. And I would like to hopefully see some folks approaching the Lethbridge Herald and see if we can't get some of these stories populated in their pages next to some of this stuff, start to create a little bit more balance. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Shut up.
Okay, don't forget to come next week. Thank you.